Thanks, Brian, for showing up. Welcome.
Yeah, absolutely, Clay. I always enjoy these. It's good
Heck
stuff.
yeah. Well, we took a break in August. That's okay. We're busy guys. We're doing the dad thing. We're doing, all kinds of things, working.
Right.
So, hey, we're back in September to do another
Very
one.
good. That's it.
Awesome. Well, to everybody that's out there listening, I think this should be a really good episode. We're going to cover a number of different things in this episode. So, we're going to talk about Um, a couple of news items in the realm of cybersecurity. Brian and I, mostly Brian's going to talk about um, cybersecurity in the context of an operational technology environment. And then we'll talk about a couple of other things that are sort of emerging. They've been happening, but we're seeing more and more of it in our security operations center. And then even like a firsthand situation that I just became aware of just before we hopped onto this call. So I guess without further ado, happy Monday to everybody, and let's get it going. So a couple of news stories I just grabbed just to kind of talk about some interesting things. So the first one is the fact that the U.S. Secret Service announced, I think they announced this last week, that earlier in August they disrupted a telecom threat. And so what? And I've got some pictures to kind of show everybody here in a minute. But what they found was over 300 SIM cards or SIM servers, and 100,000 SIM cards in about a 35-mile radius of New York. And this happened just ahead of the UN General Assembly meeting, which I think might be taking place. Was that last week or is it this week? I can't remember. But anyways,
I think it was mainly last week, I
yeah,
think.
yeah, right in proximity of that. So, what can the bad guys do with this sort of rig? These SIM farms, I mean, they can do a lot of things. So they can launch denial of service attack against cell networks and infrastructure and sort of take them down. They can also use this infrastructure to facilitate encrypted communications between the bad guys. I mean, by the way, the Secret Service, I think, already knew about this group of folks. And while I'm kind of talking, kind of pull up some of these pictures. So, and then, of course, all these things can have really negative effects, especially if they were maybe planning something else, right? If there were to be some sort of attack, a cyber attack, a kinetic attack, and then this rig here was used to disrupt cell phone communications, that can at least partially hamper law enforcement and first responder communication. I mean, Brian used to be in law enforcement, so I mean, I know radios exist. I know law enforcement's got other means of communication, but I mean, that could be potentially disruptive at least, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the comm stuff is interesting. It'd be from a forensic perspective. I wonder what kind of data they could get off of those SIM cards. That'd be a lot of SIM cards to look at to
You
try
think they
and
got a team looking through
yeah.
this?
Oh man. And then understand, that's a if you're using Cellebrite or something else, but the get in and look at the data and what they're doing and kind of track that activity. That would be interesting to see
Right.
how work through that.
Yeah, it was a bust, right? I mean, so I think this looks like maybe I don't know, an apartment or something where they busted these guys. I mean, it was a bunch of different locations, so it wasn't just one location with all the stuff in there. Distributed network of these, adversaries that the Secret Service had already, they're already known to the Secret Service and I don't know, maybe the FBI and other agencies, but they've got all these sim farm rigs wired up, and ready to roll. So interesting stuff at least.
And that's scary thinking about from a physical security perspective too, looking at they can set these things up to try to take over existing cellular networks, whatever, but they could set this up and have their own encrypted communications network that just the bad actors are using amongst themselves to coordinate stuff. And people don't think about that, but there's a lot of bad directions that they can do with that stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was doing a little bit of chat GPTing this morning, kind of exploring what all could be done with that. And you're exactly right. There's a bunch of different things that the bad guys can actually use this type of gear for. And I think you hit on a few of the big ones right there. So, The other thing that was in the news that I thought was interesting, and I mean, there's a lot of interesting news out there, so I mean, I just grabbed a couple, was this geo server compromise. Some servers that were run by the federal government, an agency within the federal government, were hit with a cyber attack, giving the bad guys the ability to run their malicious code on these federally, owned servers, and malicious code being, among other things, web shells. And if the audience isn't familiar with what a web shell is, basically it's code that you drop on a web server that can be accessed by you publicly. And then it gives you essentially command and control over the web server, so you can transfer files, you can update content on the web server itself. Sometimes you can do other things like sniff traffic, and there's lots of different things that these web shells are capable of doing, especially depending on the permissions and privilege level of the user that executes or runs the web server process itself. So like whatever is running Nginx or Apache or IIS or whatever your web server is, if that account has basically like system level access, well then when the bad guy compromises your web server, he may already have system level access in a sense from an RCE, but the web shell that he plants on there would then have those same level of permissions. So lots of bad things can happen when the bad guys are able to run code on your government geo server. Not good.
Yeah. They don't like hacking. They like to just log in. So.
They do. They love to just log in, but they're actually really good at hacking too. So, all right. So now that we've covered the news, we're going to talk about OT. And so I'll set this up real quick and kind of hand you the mic. So Dragos, which is a cybersecurity firm specializing in operational technology, the kind of systems, applications, networking, and infrastructure that you would find in energy, manufacturing, public works, any of these sorts of facilities. That's what Dragos does. So they have a platform, and you can talk a little bit more about this, that monitors for indicators of attack and indicators of compromise within these operational technology infrastructures. So they released a report, and it's kind of talking about security in the OT environment, and then like what's the financial risk. So with that kind of intro, I'll just hand you the mic.
Yeah, man. So for anyone that's not familiar with operational technology, just to kind of clarify what that is. So in my day job, I'm on the electric utility side. So for the electric side of the house, OT is the hardware, software technology that is involved with power generation and distribution. On the water utility side, it would be everything that deals with cleaning the water, tracking, transmission of that, dealing with the distribution of the cleaning agents and all those various things. So that's the two bigger targets are the electric utility space and then the water side. There's been successful attacks from Iran on the water utility side, and that actually happened. It was kind of interesting. A lot of the technology that is used across the US in the water utility space, that technology came out of Israel. And the Iranians and a lot of people in the Middle East are familiar with that because it's used in that part of the world. They've seen it. They understand the vulnerabilities. They know what's involved. They know typically what's left open. And they were able to get into several different water utilities across the US, change how chemicals and things were added or not added to water, having an impact there. And that was kind of a widespread piece for a long time. And Iran's still very active in that. On the electric utility side of things, so with the electric grid it's handled from kind of two main types of entities. You've got the investor-owned utility, which is your Duke, Dominion, your larger power companies, and then you've got the electric co-ops. So like in North Carolina, you've got the electric cooperatives. There's 26 electric co-ops across the state of North Carolina, and they're each independently owned and operated. And so for North Carolina, the electric co-ops, they cover the largest landmass, where Duke Dominion had the largest population in terms of people, customers, that kind of thing. So they have massive OT, cybersecurity resources in place. The cooperative side, it's much smaller. You've got 1-2 person teams that are kind of managing that. So you've got things like Dragos, which is what they do. They have the network, OT network monitoring. So the hardware, software, the network pieces for the OT side, Dragos helps monitor that. So like in a business IT environment where you've got a SIM, you have endpoint detection and response with something like CrowdStrike or Defender, those kind of things. You can't use those types of tools in the OT environment. So Dragos is a big player there. Cisco Cybervision, Darktrace has a OT monitoring. And there's some other players that are starting to come in. There's some cool AI stuff. There's a newer one called NetWatch AI that will help kind of with that monitoring piece or sit on top of some tools. So there's a lot of things that are kind of changing in that space. But then when you bring in, and all of the tools that are on that OT monitoring side functionally work about the same. There's different capabilities within the different tools, but basically once you load that into your environment and that's up and running and it's capturing data, it'll do asset identification and management. So it'll tell you it'll ID the assets typically by IP. Some will tell you what the devices are, give you a device name, identify that. Some will not. They're all a little bit different. Sometimes you have to go in with your engineers and look at the IP and where it's sitting and ID the asset that way. So it's a very new piece too, where the vendors that are in like making up on the utility side, you have bulk electric storage and you've got different, what are called distributed energy resources. So you see the big solar fields when you go down the highway with all the big solar panels, you've got substations, there's microgrids. Microgrids are kind of a big thing in North Carolina. And microgrids are things like that'll be set up like in a neighborhood covering 15 or 20 houses, and there's a microgrid there that literally is the backup power for that neighborhood. So if the commercial power cuts off, the microgrid literally kicks on instantaneously and can power all those homes fully while the main line is out. So historically, there's not been a lot of active cybersecurity kind of pieces around that OT side. It's been handled by the engineers and all that. And the monitoring piece is just now to where it's getting implemented in, more actively engaged and understanding what's coming in there. And then, communicating to, executive and senior leadership around the business risk involved. And if we don't, properly protect those assets, getting that stuff engaged. So there's a lot of progress and headway being made in that, but it's a challenging to kind of hit that. So there's it's interesting because there's different viewpoints depending on if you're talking to a commercial owned utility versus a co-op. The commercial owned, depending on where they are in the country, there's definitely the revenue piece is a big part of the consideration. On the co-op world, it's a little bit different. There's a concern there in terms of the cost and damage, things like that. Safety is a big consideration, but there's more of an emphasis on recovery for what's the largest group of people that are impacted. So there's a little bit of a variable in terms of what's viewed and what's more important in terms of, do we need to bring systems back on that has the revenue impact or what's impacting more people? So there's different views on how that's kind of handled across different utilities across the space. So it's interesting to hear those different approaches, what's critical and how to prioritize that. So there's a lot of different ongoing conversations around that piece, but it definitely drives a lot of different things. So it's ever changing what we're using and how that's being done changes almost daily. And like you mentioned, you're getting news and information about different things before we hopped on here. On the OT side, that's definitely we're checking those updates all the time because it changes constantly, and making sure that the alerts that we're looking at relative to the tools that we have are going to make us as effective as possible, getting the right folks in to kind of follow up and make sure there's problems. And then there's the physical security concern around the OT side. Of course, there was Moore County and other places where they've had people with rifles and stuff that have shot at different specific components within a substation. There's different pieces that involve cooling, and they know where to shoot to drain the coolant out and then it'll make that substation effectively shut down.
Yeah.
Other ways that can damage, there's things where people are flying drones into components of substation that cause damage. And there's new tech around things you can put on the outer lying edges of a substation that will throw out a disruptor so that it'll interrupt the drone communication,
No
make
kidding.
things fall out of the sky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Keep
Interesting.
people from flying drones over them.
Hmm.
So there's between the cyber and the physical piece, there's a lot to keep up with there, but it is
Yeah.
so it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, no doubt. And you mentioned something a little bit earlier, and so from our perspective and our experience here at Legion, and we don't have energy sector experience in terms of OT. We have some manufacturing sector experience. When you mentioned something earlier, it's like you can't just apply a lot of the same controls in an OT environment that you do in an IT environment. So in an IT environment, we have servers running Windows, Linux. We have workstations running Mac OS, Linux, Windows. You got all your other stuff, Wi-Fi, wired networks, and and all these other things. But for the people that aren't maybe super familiar with an OT environment, so from on the manufacturing side, we're going to see maybe some embedded systems, maybe we're going to see some Windows powered components of the OT, but a lot of it is not. A lot of it is not Windows at all. And I think, so could you just quickly talk about like why, for people that are curious, like how come you can't just put, some of the same controls in place? What's the deal?
Yeah. So that like you said, a lot of stuff isn't Windows. Some sites, depending on what that site does, may have a laptop that is purely there to kind of monitor, give you a system status, but there's things like what's called a PLC or a
Hmm.
programmable logic controller, and there's SCADA devices that don't have an operating system on them.
Right.
You can load software on it. There's the pieces and parts and the functionality in there to control the different aspects of, whether it's a substation or whatever that is, that allows the control in terms of, the controlling the power when it's, the discharge rate, when power's on, off, if it's going into feeding into batteries, the control going into those bulk electric, like the
Hmm.
big, huge Tesla batteries, how that energy is stored, when the batteries are discharged, when they're not. There's different programmable pieces there, but it's not necessarily an operating system.
Right.
There's like the thing where you had the big bulk battery piece down near Lejeune that was attached to the military base that they pulled out because there was a national security concern because the batteries were made in China, which honestly, all the Tesla batteries are made by a company called, I think it's CAT,
Yeah.
whatever. That's out of China.
Right.
They make all the Tesla batteries in the cars, Tesla batteries for the bulk electric storage. There's only one or two major facilities that are in China that make these batteries.
Hmm.
They are not US based entities yet. There's one or two that are supposed to come online, I think fairly soon, but there's not a lot of options in terms of where to buy these things from. But it was, there's a concern because of possible cellular modems in these devices
Right.
that could communicate outbound, and China get into those and be able to control it, look and see. So that's why those were pulled off so that they could break those down and kind of verify what were in those battery components, what's kind of building that up. So that was research to look into to kind of determine what needs to be done there. So it's very different stuff. There's not an operating system. It's like in cyber insurance, one of the questions they ask, do you have multi-factor authentication on all of your digital assets? Well,
Yeah.
when it comes to OT,
That's the
the
answer is
answer for
no.
us is a lot of time for that, it's no.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
honestly, because you can't put any kind of MFA on that.
Yeah.
There's nothing to support it. There's nothing that
Yeah.
you can put the software on. So
Yeah.
it's going to be secured a different way.
Yeah.
So how that access is controlled is very different. So it's a completely different animal.
Yeah, yeah, and I think if people can kind of conceptualize this, basically like a tiny little motherboard looking device, right? It's got a
Yeah.
very specific purpose. It controls a very narrow set or a narrow set of functions within the manufacturing or the electrical or the water distribution systems, whatever we're talking about. And so it's not like an operating system, like you said, that you can install an antivirus, an EDR. So that's why platforms like Cybervision, Dragos, Darktrace, and some of the other ones are really important because they're collecting the data off the network. You can't collect data necessarily off the board, right? Because there's no way to really do that. But what you can do is you can monitor inbound and outbound communications and try to detect indicators of attack and indicators of a compromise there.
Yeah, and then it gives us the visibility too, in terms of if a new device is added, or if someone tried, went, physically got onto a site and went
Yeah.
and plugging in a device to something there to actually plugging into the network, or if they got into the cellular piece and were trying to access that way, all that
Yep.
stuff is blocked. But if someone plugged into that and was trying to get in, we would see, that those tools give us the visibility saying, hey, there's
Yeah.
a device connecting or trying to connect. And that's how we kind of see that piece. So it
Yeah.
gives that side of it. But yeah, it's different stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, and we'll move on to the next topic, but I mean, that's one, I mean, what you just mentioned is just an example of like, if you look at the CIS controls, I mean, inventory management might sound mundane and it might sound like it's not that big of a deal from a cyber perspective, but for a lot of organizations and a lot of operations, especially operational technology environments, a new device up on your network can be the indicator
Oh
that
yeah.
there is a major problem going on, and without proper controls in place to know what you have and what your normal environment looks like, right, and then what's different, you're going to lack the visibility and the capability to be able to rapidly detect and then respond to whatever that threat, or maybe it's a non-threat, but whatever that threat might be, right?
Yeah. And that it goes back to the whole foundational, very baseline best practice stuff. Asset management is critical on the OT side, on the business IT
Yeah.
side. And that's a very basic thing that everyone should have done well, that a lot of places don't. And
Yep.
it's a very key thing to have in place for part of that broader cybersecurity program.
Yeah. Amen to that. All right, thanks. That was awesome. I think that's going to be, pretty helpful to a lot of people who are in that industry and maybe struggling with some of the same things that, a lot of people are in OT, which is like, how do I quantify my risks? How do I communicate these to, executive management? How do we get the resources we need in order to level up our cyber program, right? To help with that prevention, detection, response. Um, so a couple more quick topics before we close it out. So one of the things that we've been seeing arise in our SOC is the use of Microsoft infrastructure in cyber attacks, and namely, I'm talking about phishing. So that is when the bad guys are using SharePoint or other Microsoft infrastructure like Exchange Online, Microsoft 365 email, to deliver the attack payload. And as it happens, as luck would have it, so I just got an email this morning at about 10 a.m. from a contact who I had just recently been introduced to from a business perspective. They run an organization out of Tennessee, and so I got an email from this contact of mine this morning from their SharePoint system. And realistically, based on what we're kind of talking about, that's not that unusual. Like I didn't think that was strange, just given what we're doing. And so the thing was is so the email comes directly from their SharePoint. So we've got a legitimate Microsoft service with, of course, a legitimate URL that's not going to be picked up as malicious from by your email security platform, right? Because it's a legit Microsoft SharePoint URL. And then from there, ultimately you click through and it takes you to a malicious website that's designed to steal your credentials and maybe plant some malware. So it's hard, right? I mean, we're constantly as defenders telling our employees, you got to look at the URLs, you got to hover over the URL, you got to make sure where you're going. But in this case, they're in a really difficult spot because if like what happened this morning, I'm interacting with this person, this doesn't seem out of the ordinary for this particular circumstance. Now maybe that same email from this person to someone else might seem out of the blue, right? But for me it doesn't, because we're kind of in the beginning of a relationship, a business relationship here. So it's difficult, right? I mean, you've got trusted platforms, you can't tell that your user to just rely on the URL that they're seeing in the phishing email. So attackers know this, right? And they're also using sometimes Microsoft's email infrastructure to bypass email security filtering to an extent because they can sometimes get around DMARC or DKIM controls, and maybe sender policy framework SPF controls because it's being routed sort of through kind of like a back channel, right, tenant to tenant. And they're doing different things to make that happen, like generating error messages that actually come directly from Microsoft, and then it's complicated. But the long and short of it is we were talking about this before we started, filming the podcast. And you said it, we're always going to be a step behind the bad guys. They're constantly ahead of the good guys, and we are always playing catch up. So it's not easy, and everybody has to be diligent and staying on point all the time. Thoughts?
They Microsoft is such a prominent piece
Mm.
in business. Every business is using Microsoft from one end to the other. And like they have their cybersecurity tools. They've got their SIM piece. They've got Microsoft Defender for endpoint. They've got all these tools. And depending on the enterprise licensing that you have, part of that comes with that license. And there's a ton of stuff there. Now it makes me nervous and makes my spidey senses itch having massive amounts of, have the core part of a cybersecurity stuff all in Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
Your whole environment's Microsoft. So you're kind of, to me, that's like a vulnerability, having all your eggs in one basket. But
Yeah.
and SharePoint is an interesting animal because when you look at things like geo blocking, how you defend or protect SharePoint in terms of how documents and things are shared to an outside party. I've seen instances where someone has shared a document from SharePoint, shared it to an external party, and they accessed it. But the way that that particular entity accessed it, it bounced off a Google server out of Germany. And then when you look at that in a DLP tool or some other things, it turns out it monitors access. You're seeing this access coming in from another country that doesn't necessarily look right. But then when you go in and look at it and find out who shared it, have that conversation and realize, well, they shared it with this person. This was the time. You find out it's a legitimate access. And then you're like, well, and then you start talking with looking at how to secure SharePoint and how
Mm-hmm.
things are shared. It gets
Yeah.
wonky quick on how to really best do that. And
Yeah.
it's such a challenge to effectively secure how things are shared. And
I agree.
they're very good about doing what you said in terms of somehow emails or other things being compromised and sending a document or something else that's happens dead in the middle of a communication where you're expecting something,
Right.
get it, and you're expecting it, and you click on it, and it's malicious. You have no idea. And by the time you realize it, you put your credentials in, and you have a whole nother mess on your hands. So it's this hard loop to stay in front of.
Yeah, it really is. And you got some really good points. I mean, and not only so, SharePoint, Microsoft does through SharePoint give you some controls on how you share, data, and the defaults are not very good. But the problem is that sometimes you run into as an organization is the best practice from a security standpoint, and then what the business needs in the practical
Yeah.
use case, right? They don't always line up. So
Yeah.
the security team may want to put tighter sharing constraints in place, but your business side, which that's how your business makes money, right? That's, you kind of got to run on that. They can't operate like that, or it requires a lot of training, or maybe it requires some integration with a third party app in order to properly share things outside the company. So it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area there in terms of how it's in practice done in the real world.
Yeah, and that really, I have the conversation all the time with different people across sectors about how cybersecurity is not a pure IT function. It's not just
Mm-hmm.
straight IT. There that business risk component is huge. So with something like this, you need to understand what the business case is, what's the acceptable risk, what is not. Because and you have to, when you're running a cybersecurity program, you've got to walk that fine line of what's an acceptable risk, what's not, because you don't, your cybersecurity should not interfere with business and make business challenging or make it harder or interfere with that revenue piece or anything else.
Right.
The communication needs to be effective. You don't want to make it hard for your external parties or your internal people. So that it's a very hard fine line to walk.
That's true. Yeah, and and in addition to the Microsoft centric threats, and then we're not picking on Microsoft. I mean, everybody's targeted. I mean, for goodness sake. So everybody's getting targeted all the time. Microsoft just happens to be widely used. I mean, like more than
Yeah.
any other platform, so they're going to have a big target on their back. But then on top of that, it's the ingenuity of the attackers, kind of
Yeah.
like the sim farms that we just kind of talked about a few minutes ago. And then also, doing other things like using QR codes and emails. This is something that we saw a little blip of a spike about a week and a half ago within our SOC on. It's like all of a sudden we're getting these emails and we're getting alerts from multiple customers during the same 2 or 3 day period, and it's all the it's phishing using QR codes, which is a little bit of a twist, right? Because not every email platform is going to be able to determine what the target URL is for a QR code that's embedded in the body of an email. And so then you got people that are clicking these or scanning them rather on their phones and then getting phished. It's just another one of those things, right? It's novel. It's I mean, a lot of ways you think about like who in the world would actually fall for that, but that's maybe not a good way to look at it. But it does happen, yeah, and you just got to be on your toes.
It's funny because I don't know. It seems like every cybersecurity conference I go to, there's QR codes are
Yes,
everywhere. It's
everywhere.
funny. I'm like, really? We're talking about we're training our staff about and our people about being cautious of QR codes, and we're like,
Yeah.
here, look on this. It's on it. They're all every 5 feet.
All you got to do is walk into one of these conventions with
Yeah.
your own QR stickers, right? And just
App.
slide them on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Literally, it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's and we've got buddies. And I remember one of my friends from years ago where I used to work for this fintech company, and he was constantly just making noise about QR codes, and this was years ago. But he's
Yeah.
totally right. I mean, he wouldn't scan one, and I don't blame him. I don't blame him at all. So I think this might be one of the last things on the deck is kind of like social engineering combined with AI. How is that kind of playing out in the real world? So um, I think one of the big things is that it's kind of coming from a multiple different angles, right? So on the one hand, you've got threat actors who are using artificial intelligence, and sometimes this is LLMs to help them write better phishing emails, to develop better phishing campaigns to be more effective. And then you've got another angle of it, which I, just kind of heard about a month ago, maybe, what is directly targeting tools like Copilot or Gemini through hidden content that gets delivered to your inbox. Of course, the user doesn't see it, but if it's crafted correctly, Copilot, or on the Microsoft side, or Gemini, which is kind of like the Google version of Copilot, is actually interpreting these instructions, right? These prompts within the hidden part of the email and then doing what the bad guy wants them to do. So it's constantly, like you said, we're constantly trying to play catch up. We're constantly trying to figure out what are they doing, what are the bad guys doing, how in the world are we going to defend against this, how are we going to communicate this out to our customers or our end users. It's
Yeah, the impersonation piece is really scary. So it's getting to the point now to where they're just trying to they're identifying, who the C-level executives are or the leadership over specific parts of the company, and then establishing a very mundane type of phone call to get a
mm-hmm.
voice
Voice.
sample
Yes.
and then doing the impersonation, whether it's a voicemail or even there's been video calls and things like that, and using the person's actual voice from a sample and having these messages and things that are going out, and it's becoming more and more prevalent. And even outside of a business and corporate perspective, bad actors are doing that for just the everyday person. They're getting voice samples from people, finding out who their family members are, and if they're calling in if they have an elderly mother or father or other relatives, and calling them, using those voice samples to say, making these phone calls, say, hey, I'm sick, I'm hurt, I've had an accident, I need money, it's an emergency,
Mm-hmm.
I need you to send money here and do this. And it's that person's voice, it's their loved one that they're hearing from, and they're working on that knee-jerk
Yeah.
response to go help and get money sent out. So it's being used across the board for a lot of stuff. And there's so many things that are being done around the AI deception piece that it's hard to keep up with. And I'm hoping that there'll be good defensive measures that can be put in place on, phones and laptops and
Yeah.
things to kind of pick this stuff up to say, hey, this is AI. I teach two different universities, and that piece has been, and that's integrated now into how we do grading. It's in there when students submit work, we can see, it gives us a percentage of if any part of that was AI generated. So it's to kind of for that academic piece. So it's
Hmm.
everywhere. People are using it for all kinds of stuff. We
Yep.
warn our employees, hey, don't put any company proprietary data into an external AI like a chat GBT or Claude or any of that kind of stuff, because we have no control of where that data lives. You've got to be, in anything you generate with anything AI related, you need to tell your supervisor, and ultimately you're responsible for the content you generate, regardless of where that comes from. So there's a lot of concerns around all that piece. And
Yeah.
as we meet with leadership, or because they're very, a lot of we want to make things more fast and efficient and effective. We want to use AI. And I'm like, I'm right there with you. We want to, but we need to do it as securely as we can realistically do it as
Hmm.
we pull these things into our environment.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Couldn't agree with you more. All right. Well, listen. I think that kind of wraps things up. I kind of had this sitting here for the last little bit of the conversation. So, Brian, I appreciate it as always. It's always good to get together and talk about cyber. Try to do our best to get the word out, giving the audience informative information that they can use to help be more secure and defend against all these cyber attacks. So, until next
Absolutely.
time.
Absolutely, man. Enjoy
Yeah.
it.
See everybody next month.